she's 94 years old, sitting for a documentary crew in her Los Angeles home, telling stories about a man who used to be introduced to her as Uncle Al, a nickname that meant nothing to her as a small child, and meant everything once she got old enough to understand that Uncle Al was actually Al Capone. She talks about Bugsy Siegel asking her to headline the opening night of a brand new hotel in the middle of the Nevada desert called the Flamingo. She talks about a father who stole every dollar she ever earned as a child star and was secretly raising an entirely separate family on the side, using her money to do it. And she talks about all of this the way she talked about everything for nearly 90 years in show business, with a raspy, unhurried, perfectly timed sense of humor that made hard, genuinely dark material sound almost breezy. The same instinct for exactly where a laugh belonged that had carried her. Career intact, through 9 full decades and more historical eras of American entertainment than almost any other single performer alive. That documentary, called Wait for Your Laugh, premiered in November of 2017. Rose Marie died the following month on December 28th at 94 years old, having just finished telling her own story in her own voice, mere weeks before the cameras stopped rolling on her for good. By the time she went, she had outlived nearly everyone who had ever made her famous in the first place. The vaudeville impresarios who first put Baby Rose Marie on a stage, the radio executives who turned a 5-year-old into a national NBC star, the gangsters who ran the nightclubs she sang in as a teenager, and in one of the more quietly devastating details of her entire final year, even Mary Tyler Moore, her own younger co-star on the Dick Van Dyke Show, who had died 11 months earlier, in January of that same year. A family spokesman confirmed that Rose Marie had simply stopped breathing while resting in bed at her Los Angeles area home, discovered by a caretaker. The tribute posted on her official website afterward read simply, "Heaven just got a whole lot funnier." A fitting, characteristically wry farewell for a woman whose entire 9-decade career had been built on exactly that specific, dry brand of humor. Tributes poured in immediately from across multiple generations of American entertainment, including from Carl Reiner, Dick Van Dyke, Larry King, Mark Hamill, and Maureen McCormick. A genuinely striking cross-section of performers spanning several entirely separate eras of American popular culture, all of whom had, in one way or another, crossed paths with a woman whose career had somehow managed to touch nearly every decade of entertainment history, from the 1920s all the way through the 2010s. This is the story of Rose Marie Mazzetta, a girl from Manhattan who was singing for money before she'd finished learning to read, who spent nearly a full century in American show business without ever really stopping, and who became, by the very end of her life, one of the last living links to an era of entertainment that had otherwise almost entirely passed away around her. It's the story of a career that started in vaudeville and ended on Twitter, that ran through Al Capone's dining room and Bugsy Siegel's brand new casino and a beloved sitcom writer's room, and that outlasted nearly every single person who had ever shared a stage, a studio, or a marriage with her, leaving her by the time she finally passed away herself, as one of the very last people alive who could actually say she had been there for almost all of it. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who wants the real story behind the icon, not just the highlight reel, do me a favor and hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me if you knew Rose Marie was a genuine child star decades before the Dick Van Dyke Show ever existed. I read every single comment, and it genuinely helps this channel more than you'd think, especially with stories like this one, where the real history goes so much deeper than a single beloved role. Now let's go back to the very beginning, to a talent contest in Atlantic City, and a 3-year-old girl whose singing voice was about to change the entire course of her family's life. Baby Rose Marie, a father who stole her childhood earnings. Rose Marie Mazzetta was born in New York City on August 15, 1923, to Italian and Polish parents. She was only 3 years old when her mother, apparently prompted by neighbors who'd heard the little girl singing around the house, entered her in an amateur talent contest at Atlantic City's Mecca Theater. Rose Marie sang, "What Can I Say, Dear, After I Say I'm Sorry," and danced the Charleston, and she won first prize. It's the kind of story that sounds almost too neat, too much like a Hollywood invention, to have actually happened exactly that way. It happened anyway, and it set in motion nearly 9 full decades of a professional performing career that would eventually make her, by her own frequently repeated claim, the longest-running entertainer in the history of American show business. A claim that, by the time she died at 94, very few people in the industry are in a real position to dispute. It's worth understanding just how immediate and how total that transformation actually was for a family that had, only weeks earlier, had no particular connection to the entertainment industry at all. Winning a single amateur talent contest at 3 years old doesn't ordinarily launch a lasting professional career. For the overwhelming majority of children who ever win that kind of local competition, it remains exactly what it appears to be, a pleasant, one-time childhood memory. For Rose Marie, that single win at the Mecca Theater became the opening act of a career that would ultimately run for close to 90 consecutive years, an outcome so statistically improbable that it's worth pausing on the sheer, almost accidental nature of how it all actually began. A neighbor overhearing a toddler singing, and a mother deciding, on something close to a whim, to enter her into a contest with absolutely no way of knowing what that decision would eventually set in motion. It's worth remembering, too, exactly what kind of country that toddler was about to grow up performing in. The United States of 1926 was still 3 years away from the stock market crash that would trigger the Great Depression, still years away from the widespread adoption of sound and motion pictures, and still very much in the middle of the Prohibition era, a period during which organized crime figures were quietly, steadily building the exact kind of nightclub and entertainment infrastructure that would go on to shape so much of Rose Marie's own subsequent career. She was, in other words, born at almost precisely the right moment to end up walking directly into every single major transformation American entertainment would go on to undergo across the entire 20th century, catching each new wave, vaudeville's final years, the rise of radio, the arrival of sound film, the golden age of the Las Vegas casino resort, the birth of television, almost exactly as it happened, rather than arriving too early or too late to actually participate in any of it. By the time she was 5 years old, performing under the stage name Baby Rose Marie, she had become one of the hottest young stars on the NBC radio network, a genuinely remarkable achievement for a child who, by any reasonable measure, should still have been focused on learning her letters rather than headlining national radio broadcasts. She was billed as Baby Rose Marie the Child Wonder, and audiences across the country tuned in specifically to hear a small child deliver adult popular songs with a voice and a stage presence that seemed to belong to someone many times her actual age. It's worth understanding exactly what national radio stardom actually meant in the late 1920s, at the specific moment Baby Rose Marie was achieving it. Radio was, by this point, rapidly becoming the single dominant mass entertainment medium in the entire country, reaching into millions of American households on a nightly basis in a way that no other form of entertainment, including film, could yet fully match in terms of sheer simultaneous national reach. A 5-year-old becoming one of the most recognizable voices on that medium meant her voice was, quite literally, entering American living rooms across the entire country on a regular basis, a level of genuine, mass cultural penetration that very few adult performers of the era, let alone small children, ever managed to achieve. She also appeared in early talking films during this same period, one of the first generation of child performers to work specifically in sound pictures rather than the silent format that had defined the movie industry for its first 3 decades, putting her at the literal technological forefront of 2 entirely separate entertainment mediums simultaneously, all before she'd turned 6 years old. What almost none of those radio listeners knew, and what Rose Marie herself would only fully address decades later, once she was old enough and far enough removed from it to speak about it candidly, was the specific price her own family was extracting from that success. Her father, by her own later account, embezzled every dollar of her considerable childhood earnings, funneling the money away from the daughter who had actually earned it. It gets worse. He was, at the same time, secretly maintaining an entirely separate family, with 2 additional children, funded in significant part by the money his famous daughter was bringing home from her radio and stage work. Rosemary was, in other words, financially supporting a secret second family she didn't even know existed, built entirely on the earnings of a child performer too young to have any say in where her own money actually went. It's worth sitting with the specific cruelty of that arrangement for a moment, because it's easy to let a detail like this slide past as simply one more unfortunate footnote in the long, well-documented history of exploited child performers. This wasn't a case of a family struggling financially and making difficult, understandable choices about how to allocate a child star's income during hard times. This was a father actively, deliberately siphoning his own daughter's earnings to fund a completely separate, hidden household, using the money she'd earned by performing, as a small child, in front of national radio audiences, to support children she had no idea even existed. Rosemary would go on to work in show business for the rest of her natural life. But the very first chapter of that 9-decade career was built on a foundation of financial betrayal by the one person who should have been protecting her interests above everyone else's. It's worth situating that specific betrayal within the broader, genuinely troubling history of child performers throughout American entertainment. A pattern that would go on to repeat itself across generations of young stars long after Rosemary's own childhood had ended. The absence, in the 1920s and 1930s, of anything resembling the legal protections that would eventually be established decades later, specifically to safeguard child performers' earnings, protections like California's later Coogan Law, meant that a child star of Rosemary's era had essentially no legal recourse at all if a parent or guardian chose to divert their earnings elsewhere. She wasn't simply the victim of one particularly dishonest father. She was, in a broader sense, a product of an entire industry and legal system that offered working children almost no protection whatsoever, a systemic vulnerability that her own father exploited to a genuinely extreme, extraordinary degree, but that countless other child performers of her era experienced in smaller, less dramatically documented forms as well. Discovering the full extent of her father's secret second family, and the specific role her own childhood earnings had played in funding it, was, by Rosemary's own account decades later, a genuinely devastating realization to process. Arriving well after the fact, once she was old enough to fully understand exactly what had actually happened during the years she'd spent believing she was simply supporting her own immediate family. It's a story she chose to tell publicly, decades later, in both her memoir and the documentary made about her life, rather than keeping it permanently private, a choice that speaks to the same specific, unflinching directness that characterized nearly everything else about how she talked about her own remarkable, often genuinely difficult life. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, and you want more of these deep dives into the real, complicated people behind the icons we think we already know, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one, and let me know in the comments which classic entertainer's real story you'd want covered next. I read every single one. Now let's talk about the specific, strange world Rosemary grew up performing inside of. A world that included some of the most notorious organized crime figures in 20th century American history, and about how a child star actually made the genuinely difficult transition into an adult career at all, at an age when most of her contemporaries were only just beginning to think about show business as a serious possibility. Uncle Al, the Flamingo, and growing up inside the mob's entertainment circuit. As Rosemary moved out of early childhood and into her teenage years, still performing under variations of her original stage name, her career carried her directly into a specific, dangerous corner of American nightlife. The network of nightclubs, hotels, and entertainment venues owned and operated by organized crime figures during the era of Prohibition and its immediate aftermath. It was, by the mid-20th century, simply the reality of the entertainment business in many American cities. A significant share of the country's most prominent nightclubs, casinos, and hotel showrooms were financed and controlled by figures connected to organized crime. And a working entertainer, however young, had very little practical ability to simply avoid that world if she wanted steady, well-paying bookings. As a young girl, Rosemarie was introduced to Al Capone, one of the most notorious organized crime figures in American history, who insisted she refer to him simply as Uncle Al. She would later recall, with the same dry, matter-of-fact tone she brought to nearly every story from her extraordinary life, that she had no real understanding, as a child, of exactly who Uncle Al actually was or what he actually did. Her mother, she recalled, would cook meals for the men in his orbit, an ordinary, almost domestic detail, sitting directly alongside the fact that the man being served dinner was one of the most infamous criminals in the entire country. Rosemarie herself put it plainly, decades later, reflecting on exactly when the reality of who these men actually were finally became clear to her. It was years afterward, when she found herself working in Las Vegas alongside Bugsy Siegel, another notorious organized crime figure, that she said she guessed she'd finally understood, by that point, exactly what kind of men had surrounded her own childhood. It's worth dwelling on the specific, matter-of-fact way Rosemarie herself chose to narrate this part of her life in later interviews, because it reveals something genuine about the specific texture of her childhood experience. To an adult listener, hearing about a young girl being personally summoned to Al Capone's Chicago mansion and told to call him Uncle Al carries an obvious, immediate sense of menace and danger. To Rosemarie herself, recalling it as a child's actual lived experience, rather than as a piece of dramatic historical trivia, it apparently registered, at the time, as something closer to an ordinary family friendship, an adult being kind to a child performer he happened to admire, with none of the darker context attached that an outside observer would naturally bring to the same story. That gap between how a child actually experiences an objectively dangerous situation and how the same situation reads decades later, with the full weight of historical context attached, runs through nearly every account Rosemarie ever gave of this specific chapter of her life. That same gap between a child's lived experience and an adult's retrospective understanding runs through nearly every difficult chapter of Rosemarie's remarkable early life, from her father's financial betrayal to the sheer danger implicit in performing for organized crime figures as a minor. It's a pattern worth naming plainly because it says something genuine about resilience itself. The specific ability to process real, objective childhood danger without that danger fully registering, at the time, as danger at all, is precisely the kind of psychological buffer that allowed Rosemarie to keep working, keep performing, and keep building an actual career throughout a childhood that, examined honestly from the outside, contained an almost overwhelming amount of genuine hardship for a girl who hadn't yet turned 10 years old. That specific connection to Bugsy Siegel produced one of the more genuinely remarkable footnotes of Rosemarie's entire career. In 1946, she was a co-headliner on opening night at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, the casino Siegel had built, and that would go on to become one of the founding institutions of the entire Las Vegas Strip as the world would come to know it. Rosemarie was, in other words, present and performing at the literal birth of modern Las Vegas as a global entertainment destination, booked for that historic opening night at the personal request of one of the men responsible for building it. A man who would be murdered barely a year later in one of the most famous gangland killings in American history. It's worth understanding the specific historical significance of that opening night booking, because the Flamingo's 1946 launch is now widely regarded by entertainment and gambling historians alike one of the true foundational moments in the creation of Las Vegas as a major American entertainment and tourism destination, the direct predecessor to the sprawling casino resort industry that would eventually define the entire city. Bugsy Siegel had sunk an enormous, at the time genuinely staggering sum of money into building the Flamingo, driven by a specific vision of transforming a relatively small desert town into a glamorous destination resort, rather than simply another gambling outpost. Rosemarie's presence on that opening bill placed her directly at the center of a moment that the entire subsequent history of American casino entertainment would eventually trace itself back to. A level of historical proximity that very few entertainers of any era can genuinely claim. It's worth understanding what growing up inside that specific world actually meant for a young performer trying to build a legitimate, lasting career. Rose Marie wasn't simply an entertainer who occasionally crossed paths with organized crime figures at a handful of memorable moments. She spent years of her formative professional life working the specific circuit of clubs, hotels, and showrooms that these men actually owned and controlled, learning her craft, refining her comic timing, and building her professional reputation inside an entertainment ecosystem where the actual power brokers, the men who decided who got booked and who didn't, who got paid fairly and who didn't, were frequently among the most dangerous men in the entire country. Surviving and thriving inside that world for as long as she did required a specific kind of savvy and resilience that rarely gets full credit in the shorter, more polished versions of her career. It's also worth noting the specific way this history has been received by later audiences, particularly once Rose Marie herself began discussing it more openly in her later decades. Rather than treating her mob connections as a source of shame or a piece of her history to keep quietly buried, she leaned into it as some of her most reliably entertaining material, delivering these stories decades later with the same dry, unbothered comic timing that had defined her entire professional persona. It's a genuinely distinctive way of processing and presenting a childhood that, viewed from almost any other angle, contained real, sustained danger, transforming what could easily have remained a source of lasting trauma into some of the most memorable, most requested stories of her later public appearances and interviews. By her teenage years, Rose Marie was working to make the difficult transition that so many child stars of every era eventually struggled to complete, proving to an industry and to an audience that had known her exclusively as a novelty act, a small child performing adult material, that she was also a genuine, sustainable adult talent worth continuing to book once the novelty of her youth had inevitably worn off. She built a career across vaudeville, nightclubs, and eventually Broadway, appearing in the Phil Silvers musical Top Banana and its subsequent film adaptation, working steadily through exactly the kind of grinding, unglamorous circuit that so many performers of her generation relied on to actually make a living between more prestigious opportunities. That specific transition, from beloved child novelty act to credible adult performer, has ended countless promising entertainment careers throughout the history of American show business, and it's worth understanding just how genuinely difficult it actually was for Rose Marie to accomplish it as successfully as she did. Audiences and industry gatekeepers alike have historically shown real reluctance to extend the same warmth and interest to a former child star's adult work, often unconsciously continuing to expect the exact same novelty and precocity that made the performer charming in the first place, an expectation that becomes, by definition, impossible to satisfy once the performer has actually grown up. Rose Marie navigated that specific trap successfully enough to keep working steadily through her teenage years and into full adulthood, building a genuinely varied and genuinely respected body of adult work across nightclubs, Broadway, and eventually film and television. A transition that plenty of her fellow child performers from the same era were never able to complete at all, disappearing from the industry entirely once their childhood novelty had run its course. It's worth naming just how rare that particular achievement actually was, set against the broader historical record of child stardom throughout American entertainment. For every former child performer who successfully built a lasting adult career, there are countless others whose names simply vanish from the record once their novelty years end, unable to convince an industry that had only ever wanted them small and precocious to take a genuine interest in the adults they eventually became. Rose Marie's ability to make that leap successfully, not once but repeatedly, across vaudeville, radio, Broadway, film, and eventually television, stands as one of the more genuinely remarkable, if consistently underappreciated, achievements of her entire 9-decade career. Her Broadway run in Top Banana, alongside the established comedian Phil Silvers, gave her a genuinely prestigious credential during this period of professional reinvention, placing her name alongside one of the most successful comic performers of the era in a production significant enough to later warrant its own feature film adaptation. It's exactly the kind of credential a former child star needed at this specific career stage. Proof delivered by one of the most demanding and most visible stages in the entire country that the industry's most serious gatekeepers considered her a genuine adult talent in her own right, rather than simply a fading novelty from an earlier decade. And it opened doors that would go on to keep her working steadily, without any real interruption, for the rest of the decade and well into the one that followed. If this story is landing for you the way it landed for me while I was researching it, this is exactly the kind of overlooked history this channel exists to dig back up. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment telling me if you'd heard about Rosemarie's connections to Al Capone and Bugsy Siegel before today, because that specific detail alone completely changed how I understood the rest of her career. Now let's talk about the marriage that gave Rosemarie the happiest years of her adult life, and about the devastating loss that would go on to shape everything that came afterward, including the role that would eventually make her a household name. Bobby Guy, a devastating loss, and the role that finally made her a household name. In 1946, the same year she headlined the opening of the Flamingo, Rosemarie married Bobby Guy, a trumpet player who performed with Kay Kaiser's popular big band and who would go on to become the lead trumpeter for the NBC Orchestra, the ensemble that performed nightly on The Tonight Show. The two had a daughter together, Georgiana, and by every account available, the marriage represented the single steadiest, happiest, most personally fulfilling relationship of Rosemarie's entire adult life. A genuine partnership built on real love, rather than the kind of transactional show business arrangement that so many entertainment marriages of the era ended up being. It's worth understanding a little more about exactly what kind of professional life Bobby Guy himself actually had, because it places the marriage within a genuinely significant corner of mid-century American musical entertainment. The NBC Orchestra's role backing The Tonight Show meant that Bobby Guy was, for years, a nightly presence on one of the most widely watched programs in the entire country. Even if his own name never carried anything close to the same public recognition his wife's eventually would. It was, in its own way, a marriage between two people who each understood, from the inside, exactly what a demanding professional entertainment career actually required. A level of shared understanding that likely made the marriage considerably more resilient and more genuinely compatible than a pairing between an entertainer and someone entirely outside the industry might have been, both of them accustomed to late nights, touring schedules, and the specific, all-consuming demands of a working musician's or performer's life. That happiness was shattered in 1964, when Bobby Guy died of a blood infection at just 48 years old. It's worth understanding exactly how devastating that loss actually was for Rosemarie, because the specific details of her grief speak to just how genuinely central that marriage had been to her sense of stability and identity. She wore black for an entire year following his death, an old-fashioned, deeply traditional expression of mourning that few American women of the 1960s still practiced with that kind of formal, sustained commitment. And she hesitated, for a considerable stretch of time afterward, to take on any professional work beyond the single show she was already committed to at that exact moment in her career. A new sitcom that had premiered just 3 years earlier, called The Dick Van Dyke Show. It's a genuinely striking piece of timing, worth sitting with directly. Rosemarie had been cast in The Dick Van Dyke Show, playing the wisecracking, gum-chewing comedy writer Sally Rogers, in 1961, becoming, by some accounts, the second performer cast in the entire show after Dick Van Dyke himself, hired by executive producer Sheldon Leonard, who had actually played her brother years earlier on the radio program The Phil Harris Show, for a reported $1,000 an episode. A genuinely strong rate for a supporting player on a brand new, still unproven sitcom in 1961. By the time her husband died in 1964, Partway through the show's run, The Dick Van Dyke Show had become the one professional commitment Rosemarie felt able to continue honoring, even as she withdrew from nearly every other kind of outside work in the immediate aftermath of losing Bobby Guy. The role that would go on to define the rest of her public career, in other words, wasn't simply a professional triumph that happened to coincide with a period of personal devastation. It became, quite literally, the single thing she leaned on to keep working at all during the hardest stretch of her entire adult life. It's worth thinking through exactly what that specific arrangement actually asked of her, night after night, during those first difficult months of widowhood. Sally Rogers was, by design, one of the funniest, sharpest-tongued characters on American television at the time. A role that required Rosemarie to walk onto a soundstage, deliver rapid-fire comic dialogue with flawless timing, and make an entire studio audience laugh, all while privately grieving the sudden loss of her husband of 18 years. That specific, genuinely difficult juxtaposition, performing professional comedy at the very top of her craft while carrying real, private devastation just off camera, speaks to a level of professional discipline that few actors are ever actually tested on in quite so stark a fashion. And yet, by every account from her co-stars, none of that private grief ever visibly interfered with the quality of the work she continued delivering week after week. The Dick Van Dyke Show itself, created by Carl Reiner and drawing directly on his own experiences writing for Sid Caesar's variety programs, told the story of Rob Petrie, played by Van Dyke, the head writer of a fictional hit comedy variety show, and his wife Laura, played in her first major television role by a young Mary Tyler Moore. Rosemarie's Sally Rogers, alongside Maury Amsterdam's Buddy Sorrell, rounded out the show's writer's room, delivering some of the sharpest, fastest-paced comic dialogue on American television at the time. The show struggled somewhat in its first season before catching on decisively with audiences, running from 1961 to 1966 and remaining a beloved fixture of American television reruns for decades afterward. Rosemarie earned 3 Emmy Award nominations for Best Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series across the show's run, a genuine, sustained piece of industry recognition for a character built specifically around exactly the kind of sharp, rapid-fire comic delivery Rosemarie had spent decades perfecting on the vaudeville and nightclub circuit. Sally Rogers herself carried a specific kind of cultural weight that extended well beyond her comic function within the show's individual episodes. She was written as an unmarried professional woman working a demanding job in a competitive, male-dominated creative field, a genuinely unusual kind of character for American network television to place at the center of its comedy in the early 1960s. Years before the more overt, feminist-inflected sitcom characters of the 1970s would become considerably more common. Sally's recurring, self-deprecating jokes about her own difficulty finding a husband functioned as both comic material and, in retrospect, a genuinely pointed reflection of the specific, narrow set of options American culture of the era still offered a woman who had chosen a demanding career over an early marriage. Rosemarie brought a level of lived, authentic understanding to that specific character. Having spent her own entire adult life, up to that point, balancing a demanding professional career against the more conventional expectations placed on women of her generation. A balance she'd already been actively negotiating for decades by the time Sally Rogers ever appeared on American television screens. Notably, Rosemarie had been nominated for 3 consecutive Emmy Awards during the show's run without ever actually winning, a genuinely frustrating pattern that plenty of deserving supporting performers across the history of American television have experienced, watching a specific role earn repeated formal industry recognition without ever quite translating into the statuette itself. It's a small but telling detail that fits into the broader pattern of Rosemarie's entire career. Genuine, sustained, widely acknowledged excellence that somehow never quite culminated in the single, career-defining formal accolade that a performer of her caliber might reasonably have expected to eventually receive. Rosemarie herself never seemed to dwell on that specific gap with any real bitterness, at least not in any of her later public accounts of the show's run. By her own recollection, the show itself, and the specific creative freedom she was given within it to bring decades of accumulated comic timing to Sally Rogers's rapid-fire dialogue, represented one of the genuine professional highlights of her entire 9-decade career, regardless of whether that specific work was ever formally rewarded with the single golden statuette that so many of her contemporaries eventually received. It's a detail worth holding on to as this story moves toward its final chapters, because it's entirely consistent with the specific, hard-won equanimity Rosemarie seemed to have developed toward her own career by the time she reached her later decades. Genuine gratitude for the work itself, offered without any lingering resentment toward whatever formal recognition happened to come, or not come, along with it. It's worth addressing directly a piece of behind-the-scenes tension that Rosemarie herself was candid about in later interviews and in the 2017 documentary made about her life. A real, acknowledged frustration with the specific way the show's creative team, and Carl Reiner in particular, chose to position Mary Tyler Moore relative to her own role. Rosemarie resented that Moore was given more overall prominence within the show than she was, a grievance she apparently raised with Reiner directly enough that he had a specific, blunt response ready for her, recalled decades later in his own words. "I used real strong language. I said, 'You both have beautiful legs. They want to look at her legs.'" It's a genuinely revealing exchange, one that captures, in a single blunt joke, exactly the kind of unvarnished honesty that apparently characterized much of the show's internal working relationships. And it's worth including here, rather than smoothing over, because it's a reminder that even one of the most beloved, most fondly remembered sitcoms in American television history was, behind the scenes, a workplace with real, ordinary professional tensions running underneath the polished final product the audiences actually saw on their screens. It's worth understanding the specific, uncomfortable logic embedded in Reiner's blunt response, because it reveals something genuinely revealing about the era's underlying industry assumptions. His answer wasn't a denial that Rosemarie's frustration had any basis in fact. It was, in effect, a direct confirmation of exactly the dynamic she'd suspected, delivered with a shrug rather than an apology. Mary Tyler Moore, cast as the show's young, conventionally glamorous wife, was always going to receive a specific kind of visual and narrative emphasis that Rosemarie's character, the sharp-witted, unmarried career woman, played by a performer considerably further along in her own career, simply wasn't going to be given, regardless of how genuinely funny or how genuinely skilled Rosemarie's own performance actually was. It's the exact same industry-wide pattern that had already shaped so much of Rosemarie's earlier career, going all the way back to her difficult teenage transition out of child stardom. A persistent, structural preference for youth and conventional glamour that, decade after decade, kept shaping which performers got top billing and which ones, regardless of talent, ended up doing some of the sharpest work in the room from a supporting position instead. That specific frustration, worth noting, never seems to have curdled into any lasting personal animosity between Rosemarie and either Reiner or Moore herself. She continued working alongside both of them for the remainder of the show's run, and she spoke, in her later interviews and in the documentary made about her life, about the show's entire cast and creative team, with genuine warmth and evident pride in what they had all built together. It's a specific, mature kind of professional grace that runs through nearly every account of Rosemarie's later reflections on her own career. An honest, unflinching acknowledgement of real frustrations and real professional slights, delivered without any accompanying bitterness, and paired, almost always, with genuine gratitude for the opportunities and the collaborators that had actually come her way across 9 remarkable decades of work. Hollywood Squares, Doris Day, and the friendships that outlasted the fame. After the Dick Van Dyke Show ended its run in 1966, Rosemarie continued working steadily across nearly every corner of American entertainment for the next 5 decades, refusing to let the end of her single most iconic role slow down a career that had already, by that point, spanned 4 full decades on its own. She became a regular fixture on the original version of Hollywood Squares, appearing on the game show from 1966 through 1980, occupying one of its recognizable panel seats for 14 consecutive years, and becoming, for an entire generation of American television viewers who had no memory of her earlier vaudeville or radio work, simply one of the reliably funny, familiar faces they saw on their screens on a near-daily basis. She also found genuine, sustained success reuniting with an old friend and colleague from earlier in her career. From 1969 to 1971, Rosemarie co-starred on The Doris Day Show, working alongside a woman who had, by that point, become one of the biggest movie stars in the world, and who would go on to remain one of Rosemarie's closest personal friends for the rest of both of their lives. The two women's friendship endured for close to 5 decades, long after Doris Day had famously retreated from the entertainment industry's public spotlight in 1973 to focus on animal welfare advocacy, a level of private, sustained loyalty that stood in genuine contrast to Day's otherwise famously reclusive later decades, during which she granted very few interviews and made almost no public appearances at all. When Doris Day did agree to a rare interview discussing her old friend, prompted by the release of the 2017 documentary about Rosemarie's life, it stood as a genuinely notable exception to Day's decades-long pattern of avoiding the press entirely. A testament to exactly how much the friendship actually meant to her, and a genuinely rare public gift from a woman who had spent decades protecting her own privacy above almost everything else. Rosemarie also played a genuinely significant, largely uncredited role in launching another performer's career during this same general period. While visiting a CBS affiliate station in Cleveland to help promote the Dick Van Dyke Show, she met a young local actor named Tim Conway, who was, at the time, performing sketches for the station with essentially no national profile at all. Recognizing his talent, Rosemarie became his manager and was directly responsible for getting him his first major national opportunity, a regular spot on The Steve Allen Show. Tim Conway would go on to become one of the most beloved comic performers of his own generation, largely through his later work on The Carol Burnett Show. And it was Rosemarie, already a genuine star in her own right, who first spotted his talent and personally opened the door that eventually led him toward that entire career. A debt of gratitude Conway himself acknowledged publicly for the rest of both of their lives. In 2001, Rosemarie received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a formal, permanent piece of industry recognition arriving nearly 75 years after her professional career had actually begun. Carl Reiner spoke at the ceremony, recounting decades of shared experiences working alongside her, a fitting piece of institutional acknowledgement for a performer whose actual working life, by that point, had already outlasted the careers of nearly everyone else, being honored with similar stars around her on the same stretch of Hollywood Boulevard. Now let's talk about what all of that longevity actually added up to by the very end of her life, and about the specific, remarkable way she got to close out a 9-decade career on her own terms, telling her own story before anyone else could ever get the chance to tell it for her. What the real story actually leaves us with, there's a version of Rosemarie's story that's simply a triumph, and every fact in it holds up completely. A 3-year-old girl who won a talent contest and went on to become one of the biggest child stars on American radio, who survived a genuinely exploitative childhood and a dangerous professional world controlled by organized crime figures, and who built, out of sheer talent and persistence, a career spanning close to 9 full decades. Vaudeville, radio, Broadway, nightclubs, film, and finally television, where she earned 3 Emmy nominations for a role that remains, to this day, one of the most beloved supporting characters in the history of American sitcoms. A woman who went on, after the Dick Van Dyke Show ended, to spend 14 years as a fixture of Hollywood squares, to co-star alongside her real-life best friend Doris Day on The Doris Day Show, to personally discover and manage the early career of a young Cleveland television performer named Tim Conway, and to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2001, in recognition of a career that, by that point, had already run for the better part of 75 years. That version isn't wrong, but there's another version, equally true, and it's the version worth sitting with a little longer before we close this out. It's the version of a little girl whose own father stole every dollar she earned as a child star to secretly fund an entirely separate family she didn't even know existed. It's the version of a young performer who grew up navigating a professional world controlled in large part by some of the most dangerous organized crime figures in American history, learning her craft in rooms owned by men like Al Capone and Bugsy Siegel, because that was simply where the work actually was. It's the version of a woman who found the single great love of her adult life in Bobby Guy, and who lost him suddenly at 48 years old, wearing black for a full year afterward, and clinging to the one professional commitment she couldn't bring herself to abandon, even in the depths of that grief. And it's the version of a woman who, by the very last year of her extraordinarily long life, had quietly outlived nearly everyone who had ever been part of making her famous in the first place. The vaudeville performers, the radio executives, the gangsters, her own husband, most of her Dick Van Dyke Show castmates, and in one final, genuinely poignant piece of timing, even her own younger co-star, Mary Tyler Moore, who died just 11 months before she did. It's worth taking the specific measure of exactly how much of 20th century American entertainment history Rose Marie had personally, directly outlived by the time she herself finally passed away. Her Dick Van Dyke Show castmate, Richard Deacon, who played the blustering producer Mel Cooley, had already died in 1984, more than 3 decades before Rose Marie's own death. Her writing room partner, Maury Amsterdam, died in 1996, more than 20 years earlier. Bobby Guy had been gone since 1964, more than half a century. The radio executives who first put a 5-year-old on national NBC broadcasts had died, in the ordinary course of things, decades before Rose Marie herself reached old age. Al Capone died in 1947. Bugsy Siegel was murdered in 1947, barely a year after Rose Marie had performed at his hotel's opening night. Nearly every single name attached to the earliest, most formative decades of her own career had already been gone, in some cases for well over half a century, by the time Rose Marie herself finally reached the end of her own extraordinarily long life. By the time Rose Marie herself finally passed away in December of 2017, she had become one of a genuinely small handful of living Americans who could still speak, from direct personal memory, about performing in vaudeville houses, about being personally introduced to Al Capone, about the literal founding night of the Las Vegas Strip as the world would come to know it. She wasn't simply a performer with an unusually long career. She was, by the very end, a living historical archive, one of the last remaining direct witnesses to nearly a full century of American entertainment history that had otherwise almost entirely passed into the realm of old photographs, archival footage, and second-hand retelling, a kind of living connective tissue between the vaudeville era and the age of social media that will almost certainly never exist again in quite the same form. The specific detail of Mary Tyler Moore's death, arriving just 11 months before Rose Marie's own, deserves particular attention, because it inverts the usual expected order of things in such a genuinely striking way. Mary Tyler Moore had been the show's young ingenue, cast in her first major television role at a considerably younger age than Rose Marie, who was already an established, decades-long veteran of show business by the time the Dick Van Dyke Show began. By any ordinary actuarial expectation, the younger co-star should reasonably have been expected to outlive the older one by a considerable margin. Instead, Rose Marie, already 62 years into her professional career by the time Mary Tyler Moore's own career had even begun, ended up watching her younger colleague pass away first. One more instance of the same specific, recurring pattern that defines so much of Rose Marie's remarkably long later life, outliving people who, by any reasonable expectation, should have outlived her. Rose Marie got to spend the final months of her life doing something remarkably few entertainers of her era, or any era, ever actually get the chance to do. Sitting down, at 94 years old, and telling her own complete story, in her own words, to a documentary crew that captured all of it just in time. Wait for Your Laugh premiered in November of 2017. She died in December. There was no long, uncertain gap between the telling of her story and the end of her life. No posthumous documentary assembled by other people trying to reconstruct who she'd actually been from second-hand accounts and old footage. She got to say it all herself, sharp and funny and completely unfiltered, right up until the very end, closing out a career that had somehow managed to outlast nearly every single person who had been there when it all began. It's worth understanding just how physically demanding it actually was for Rosemarie to complete that final documentary project at all. By the time filming took place, she was 94 years old, living with arthritis and relying on a wheelchair to get around. And yet, by every account from the people who worked on the film alongside her, her memory and her storytelling instincts remained completely intact. Sharp enough to carry an entire feature-length documentary, largely on the strength of her own recollections and her own comic delivery. Carl Reiner, by then 95 years old himself, called it the best documentary about a celebrity he had ever seen, a genuinely striking endorsement coming from a man who had spent his own entire career working alongside some of the biggest names in American entertainment. He also recalled, in the same conversation, telling Rosemarie directly, after reading her 2002 memoir Hold the Roses, that she had a lot of reasons to be a lot crazier than she actually was. A blunt but genuinely admiring acknowledgement of just how much genuine hardship she had absorbed across her life without ever letting it define or embitter the person she actually became, and a fitting closing verdict from a man who had known her and worked alongside her for the better part of 6 decades. Even in her final years, confined to a wheelchair and dealing with the ordinary physical limitations of advanced old age, Rosemarie remained an active, engaged public presence, building a genuine following of more than 125,000 people on Twitter, where she regularly posted witty, characteristically sharp observations right up until close to the very end. It's a genuinely remarkable final chapter for a performer whose career had begun in the era of silent film and live vaudeville, watching her adapt, in her 90s, to an entirely new social media platform that hadn't existed for the overwhelming majority of her 9-decade career, and doing so with evident enthusiasm rather than reluctant, begrudging participation. There's one final detail worth ending on. Rosemarie, characteristically, apparently never gave much thought to the specific, almost mathematical improbability of her own longevity. She simply kept working, decade after decade, treating each new era of American entertainment as just the next room to walk into. That's the real story behind the woman everyone remembers as Sally Rogers. Not just the wisecracks and the 3 Emmy nominations, but 9 decades of American entertainment history compressed into a single remarkable life. A life that began in a Depression-era talent contest and ended with her being, by the time she finally passed away, one of the very last living witnesses to almost the entire history of 20th-century American show business. It's worth closing on the specific, almost impossible arc of a life that began with a 3-year-old singing for a talent contest prize and ended with a 94-year-old woman cracking jokes for a documentary crew and 125,000 Twitter followers. Very few human lives, let alone entertainment careers, actually span that particular kind of full historical arc, from the last years of silent film and vaudeville all the way through the birth of modern social media, remaining an active, working professional the entire way through. Rosemarie wasn't simply present for that entire journey. She was actively performing, actively working, actively making people laugh for nearly every single year of it. A level of sustained professional relevance that very few entertainers in the entire history of the medium have ever come close to matching, and that almost certainly never will be matched again in quite the same way. Given how completely the entertainment landscape she came up in, vaudeville houses, live radio broadcasts, mob-run nightclubs, has since disappeared entirely from the world. If this story gave you a completely different picture of Rosemarie than the sitcom highlight reel ever let you see, do me a favor. Hit like, drop a comment telling me what part of her real story surprised you the most, and subscribe so you're here for the next one. Because there are so many more of these. Entertainers whose real complicated lives ran so much deeper than the single role most people remember them for. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.